Well, hello again. I hope you are suffering your quarantine with dignity. I am not. My gin supplies ran out before I could even finish binging Tiger King, so that's how things are going here. I still have whiskey though, so all is well. It's me, Zach Hagadone, returning for our second installment of 13 Minutes of History with Zach. I'd like to thank you all for your kind words and your generous support following our last video. I've received a few requests for topics to discuss. I won't be able to get to them today. I'm still researching them. But as we continue through our quarantine and our self-isolation, I'm sure I'll have plenty of time to put those together. Well, in the meantime, I would like to return, as we had last week, to the 18th century period in colonial New York. And the reason I fixate on that is that it's what I ended up studying for my master's. So this story is one that I came across in the course of my thesis research. It didn't make it into the thesis, but I thought it was a great little vignette. It involves the politics of land ownership. It involves the matrix of colonial, indigenous, and community power structures. It touches on gender roles and the persistence of myth in American history. With a little spiced addition of extreme violence and ritual humiliation, just to keep things interesting. So this is the story of Magdalena Zeh, last name spelled Z-E-H, and a certain Sheriff Adams. And it begins with, well, for some context, we have to go back to 1709 and 1710, when a group of German speakers from the Rhine river drainage in what is today Germany picked up and left in enormous numbers between 1709 and 1710. A total of 30,000 of these people just up and left over the course of a few months, making their way first to Rotterdam and then navigating through the colonial, imperial, English, European systems of immigration and customs. A lot of them were sent back. Many of them just decided not to get on the boats. But of the 30,000 that showed up in Rotterdam, about 13,000 ended up in London. What made these people unique, not only for their numbers, was that they all shared a common destination. Whereas immigration and migration in sort of the Rhine drainage, sort of German principalities, up to that point had been focused more toward the east, settling in places in Central Europe. This was a mass westward migration. And for all the many reasons that they decided to leave, the one thing that sort of bound them together is that they thought they were going to get free land and live in this sort of Edenic paradise in North America. They thought that the Queen of England, Anne, who shared their Protestant religion by and large, they thought she was going to be their benefactress, essentially. But when they showed up in London, 13,000 of them over the course of a few weeks, they had a rude discovery that the English did not want them there, that they represented a foreign horde. They were an immigration crisis, like we would recognize today. 13,000 people going into London represented, I think it was something like 2% of the population, which was a huge strain, and as you can imagine, pretty shocking. If you can think about 2% of a major world capital suddenly being filled with immigrants, that's kind of what happened. So, long story short, of the 13,000 so-called Palatines, which is the name they acquired as a group while they were in London, and that name comes from a principality in the sort of the Rhine drainage, the Palatinate. They were by no means from that particular region. The people in this migration came from all over the Rhine drainage, but the English found it convenient just to call them all Palatines and be done with it. So that was a group identity that they did not have prior to that experience in the London refugee camps. So of the 13,000, 3,000 were allowed to eventually journey on to North America. Others in the group were settled in Scotland, some went to Ireland, others just went home. Others were sent home forcibly when it was discovered that they were Catholics instead of the Protestants that they professed to be. So the lucky 3,000 that made it out of this gigantic migration of that group, 2,000 went to the colony of New York, and 1,000 went to the Carolinas, which was the intended destination for all of them. But you can see only 1,000 actually made it to that destination. So the 2,000 that made it to New York are what we're talking about, and they showed up after a terrible passage across the Atlantic, bouts of disease, the usual stuff you would expect from an 18th century transatlantic crossing. They had to spend some time in basically their own quarantine on Governor's Island in New York, and after they were cleared, they were sent north up the Hudson River, where they were to be indentured to a leading New York merchant named Robert Livingston, who owned a very expansive manor/plantation near present-day Rhinebeck. So these 2,000 thereabouts had intended to go become farmers in this paradise, of the Carolinas, but instead found themselves after this horrendous voyage in sort of the muggy, in the summer very muggy, in the winter very cold, completely uncultivated, other than Livingston's manor. This place where they were essentially feudal serfs, which would have felt disturbingly familiar to the power structures they knew back in their homes in the German principalities. They had to live in these little huts they made themselves. Some accounts describe them as being made out of bark, so they were not these great sort of settler, pioneer type cabins. They were hovels, most likely. And their work was in the pine forests nearby. They had to journey often for weeks at a time into the forest, and their job was to strip bark off pine trees, or collect pine cones, or pine knots, limbs that had fallen off, and then process the pitch into tar, which Robert Livingston, with the cooperation of the New York governor, Robert Hunter, had struck a deal to sell this tar to the British Navy, which would then use the tar to seal the masts of its warships. So this was kind of a military-industrial complex operation that was being executed using indentured immigrants. So, needless to say, the Palatines, who were, as I mentioned, all mostly farmers. A lot of them were vine growers. These were not people who worked in the woods, and they didn't particularly want to be indentured servants. They wanted farmland for free, somewhere where no one was going to bother them. This situation went on with increasing foul mood for at least a year, until around, 1712-ish, thereabouts. The Palatines just up and rebelled. They surrounded the manor house with guns. They threatened, to shoot everybody. They made all these demands. They eventually backed down when a bunch of soldiers from Albany came up with the governor. But the die had been cast. The Palatines were finished with the situation. Livingston was finished with the situation too. He was sick of these people. He was tired of paying for them, and the tar making operation was not turning a profit. Hunter, the governor, had been investing his own money to support this thing that was failing rapidly. So, round about the wintertime, of course, as the weather was starting to get bad, Livingston and Hunter both just basically pulled the plug on the whole thing and told the Palatines, go off and figure out what you're going to do for the winter, come back in the spring, and we can start this over again. The Palatines were like, well, okay, yeah, we'll leave, all right, but we're not going to come back. So they left. Hundreds of them, many families. Some stayed in the Rhinebeck area, but a lot of them decided to cut a road 50 miles northwest from where Rhinebeck is today to an area in the Schoharie Valley, which is or Schoharie County, which we would call it today. They went there at supposedly the invitation of local indigenous tribes who felt some sympathy for the plight of these people. And the Palatines had clearly no love for the colonial governor. They had definitely no love for their colonial merchant, lord. So they were done with English colonial society. They wanted to live out in the frontier, quote unquote. The frontier of colonial society. It definitely wasn't a frontier for the indigenous people. It was where they lived. But I find it interesting that the indigenous groups welcomed these sort of strange Europeans into their territory and allowed them to settle. They eventually built 7 little towns, each named for the last name of the community leader. For instance, Weisersdorf was named after Konrad Weiser, who was a character in our story. Which, by the time they have these 7 little cities or little settlements set up, in Skahari, they're doing great. They're happy they don't have to deal with Hunter and Livingston anymore. They've integrated themselves pretty well, with the indigenous tribes. The tribes are trading freely. People are moving back and forth. Palatine children are being apprenticed in some of the indigenous villages to learn, bushcraft, the landscape, presumably some history of the area. So they had completely turned their back on English colonial society by this point. So, in about 1715, after the Palatines had established themselves and were doing reasonably well, the authorities in Albany and sort of the English/British, as it was becoming to be known after 1707 with the Act of Union, which is a whole other thing. Suffice to say, by 1715, the English colonial authority was beginning to start to look like what we would recognize as the imperial British colonial authority. So much more centralized, a lot more aggressive with its dealings with people it didn't assume were, fit into their matrix. Anyway, people were getting rich in Albany, and a group of rich merchants, associated with guys like Livingston, had been doing what rich guys do when they don't have anything else to do, and that is that they bought other people's land out from under them. So they were doing this to the west of Albany, so across the Hudson, and then encroaching into indigenous lands, and also the areas where the Palatines were living. So unbeknownst to the Palatines, these so-called partners in Albany had bought up the land that they were living on. So they sent a guy out, last name of Bayard, who had a bunch of documents and deeds and instruments and what kind, various papers that the Palatines were supposed to sign, or else, pay rent or get out, was pretty much what he was there to tell them. They didn't cotton to this, as you might imagine. So they essentially chased Bayard out of town. He felt afraid of it for his life enough that he bunkered himself inside this inn where he'd been staying. The Palatine men chased him there, surrounded the place, and then opened fire on it with their muskets. I read one account that said something like 60 musket balls, going through the roof, through the walls. Bayard was scared out of his mind. Apparently he tried to fire back with his pistols out the front window. The Palatines receiving, return fire were distracted. He used that as an opportunity to run out the back door, and then, made his way to Albany as quickly as possible, where he reported that, these people were just unhinged. So this put the Palatines definitely on the radar of the Albany real estate elites. So, given that, the Albany grandees decided to, kind of up the game a little bit. They found a sheriff named Sheriff Adams and told him to, go out there and figure out what's going on with these, quasi-barbarian, sort of wild Germans who had gone native out in the forest. So, in the meantime, settlers such as Mr. Vroman, who was a friend of the governor's, had decided to just go ahead and settle out there himself. So he was building a house somewhere near Weisersdorf on land that the Palatines considered to be theirs. They heard about it. They went out there, found his foundation already set in place. They saw him clearing land, for fields. Various other buildings were being constructed. So in the night, while Vroman and his son and their African slave were asleep, the Palatine men tore everything apart, took it down stone by stone, and then ran horses through the camp with bells attached to them so that it woke everybody up and then scared them. So the next morning, Vroman and his son and the slave, they get up and they survey this damage. As they're sort of kicking rocks around in the field, a couple of Palatines come out of the woods, including Konrad Weiser, and they have a confrontation. Weiser basically tells them, to buzz off, they have no authority to be here, it's their land, and if they don't, and he makes a very direct threat. So if Vroman and others like him don't leave the Palatines alone, they're going to use their leverage with the local indigenous tribes, and they're going to, use the tribes to essentially come in and wipe them out. And this is the most terrifying thing you could say to a colonial North American European at this time. They lived in constant dread of the skulking Indians. So to see fellow Europeans, such as these Palatines, these German speakers, invoking, an indigenous power against English colonial authority was just like the whole world was turned upside down. This was the most treasonous thing you could do, and it sort of removed the Palatines from human society as far as a lot of these guys in Albany were concerned. So this was a very unsettling experience for Vroman and for everyone who heard about it. So this is what really ramped it up. Sheriff Adams was already assigned to go out into the Palatine areas to suss them out and to kind of read them the Riot Act. Well, Hunter heard about what had happened to his buddy Vroman and very quickly issued an arrest warrant for Konrad Weiser and then handed that to Adams and said, you take this out there and you arrest this guy, bring him back, he needs to be dealt with. So Adams, fully deputized now, goes out to the village and tries to present his papers. Meantime, Konrad Weiser had heard that he was about to get arrested. So he skipped town. He'd already left, and he had made his way to Maine, and he was trying to get to London so that he could bring the Palatine's case before Queen Anne, because, despite everything that had happened with the colonial authorities and with the rich guys in New York colony, they still apparently saw the Queen as the person that they should be beholden to. They at least thought they could ask for and receive justice from the monarch, which also kind of gives you a glimpse into the way they viewed where authority was in the so-called New World. Community authority, local authority, came from a partnership between the Palatine communities and their indigenous surrounding tribes. And when it came to a sort of colonial, imperial context, a North American context, authority rested with the monarch. Everybody between, so all these colonial governors and merchants and whatnot, Palatines didn't see them as legitimate sources of authority, which is interesting. So anyway, Konrad Weiser's gone. He's on the lam. Adams comes in, shows up in Weisersdorf to find no Palatine men, only the women. So the ladies of the community had turned out to greet Sheriff Adams. So there's wives, there's daughters, there's grandmas, like everybody. And this is where the stories start to differ a little bit. But the one thing that has always been a part of this story, which has been told and retold since at least the early 1800s, is that one woman, Magdalena Zay, was the ringleader. Some frame her as kind of a warrior woman. Some frame her as a, half barbarian, Germanic, Teutonic wild woman with a club. Others make her out to be some sort of like crazy shrew. It's hard to say. I mean, some even call her an Amazon, like an Amazonian warrior, like giant woman with huge muscles. So suffice to say, she's always seen as the leader, and she's seen as fairly fearsome, no matter what. So it's unclear who started the altercation. Some sources will say that Adams tried to put his hand on somebody, and then when he did that, it violated the village norms, and that precipitated an attack on him. Others say that he was just set upon by Magdalena Zay and her comrades. Regardless, Adams got taken down. They beat him to the ground. They dragged him up and down the street. They dragged him through the animal pens, hitting him, kicking him the whole time. So he's covered in mud and excrement. And then they decided to put him on a rail, and they ran him on the rail, just breaking his groin the whole time, because you don't just put somebody on a rail and carry them. You bounce it up and down. You make sure they don't fall off so that they're getting maximum groin damage. So he gets run on this rail through all the different towns, all 7 of the different communities, just to show off that they had given him what for. They finally bring him out to a bridge somewhere in the vicinity, which is pretty symbolic place that signifies the beginning and the end of a community, of the inside and the outside. So they take him to this bridge, throw him down. Magdalena Zay grabs either a fence post or straight up a club, according to some chroniclers, and she just starts, laying into Adams as he's laying there. She breaks one of his ribs. She pops out one of his eyes, hits him so hard. And to top it off, according to some, she pours a bunch of water on his face, splashes something on his face, and others become much more graphic about it, saying that she hiked up her skirts, squatted over him, and then, urinated on him. So he was left in a terrible condition, presumably to die, to crawl off somewhere, who knows. So they left him on the bridge. A couple of people who've told this story going back to the 1820s have said that, he crawled himself about halfway or 7 miles or, a long way toward Albany before being picked up. Some others say that he was picked up right on the spot by someone. Doesn't matter. Somehow or another, this man managed to make it all the way from Weisersdorf, which is present-day Middleburg, to Albany. And having driven that road myself, I cannot imagine that he crawled in that condition very far. He made it back, reported what had happened, and of course the colonial authorities were just like, who are these people? Like, we have these wild, savage Germans. They didn't know what to do, so they essentially just left him alone for the next couple of years. Meanwhile, Konrad Weiser was on his way to London. He eventually arrived in like 1720. So this was, this incident had a long tail. Weiser's story is a whole different thing, but the case was presented, and nothing really came of it, other than the Palatines just got tired of dealing with, the encroachment of colonial New York society, so they moved on to Pennsylvania, where they became what we call the Pennsylvania Dutch. They weren't actually Dutch. People just call them that. So, yet again, another made-up name for, a made-up people. So, it was a good story, I think, in that it touches on all kinds of just bizarre, intricate relationships and social structures and, structures of power, identity, politics that were occurring in a period that was very early on in what we consider, American history. Whether or not it's true, that's another thing I find very interesting. In my research, I could find no reference to anyone named Sheriff Adams anywhere. Other researchers over the years have tried to find Sheriff Adams, but no one by that name appears in the New York Civil Service rolls until the 1840s. A lot of the other stuff, the arrest warrant, the story of Konrad Weiser escaping, of going to England, that's all verified, in primary source documents from the time. There are allusions to something very unseemly that occurred, but it's a little bit hard to discern in the records whether they're referring to a person named Sheriff Adams. They certainly never use his name, or if they're talking about the incident with Bayard. Bayard is mentioned. He's a prominent person in colonial New York history. So his incident is very well documented, as is the one with Vroman, because it resulted in the arrest warrant for Konrad Weiser. But the idea that Magdalena Zay, a particular person, beat this man so badly that she broke his rib, popped his eye out, and then peed on him, sort of uncritically included in a lot of histories of the Palatines and of early colonial New York history. Up until about 2004, when a historian named Philip Otterness, who's made this kind of his specialty, points out in one of his footnotes, I believe, saying, we don't have any evidence this actually happened. Yet, it remains a favorite story of the 21st century descendants of the Palatines. And I can attest to that because I am one. And I like that story. So, I hope you like that story as well. Next time, can't say when it'll be, but I will get to some of these requested bits of history. So thanks again for watching, and quarantine well. All right.